Hey, greetings and welcome to April 6th. This is lecture 2. Hopefully the last lecture encouraged you a little bit about kind of where you are as you're navigating your own journey right now, and even what God sees in you. I want to just tell you that I've been so impressed by you all throughout this semester. You're such a resilient bunch, and I know that this is exceedingly difficult, but I do believe that all of this is going to form and shape you to be used. I was listening to my church yesterday. I go to a Community Christian Church of Lincoln Park. It's a massive church, it's a massive mega church out in the suburbs. But then it's got 11 different locations, 2 of which are in prisons. One is in Lincoln Park in the city, and the other one's in Lincoln Square in the city. I go to Lincoln Park campus, and I was watching online our service yesterday, and the preacher was talking about how God has a way of forming us through our suffering and through our struggle, through the brokenness of our stories, so that we can be used as we emerge from those struggles. And I believe that of you. Now, I want to talk about what happens to us as we navigate the complexity of our broken, fragile, shaky foundationed stories. That when our stories fail us, and we spent the last lecture on Friday's lectures talking about this, that it does something to us. It creates in us a shadow side or an imposter. And by this, what I mean is there's an authentic you, one that has been created, purposed, fearfully and wonderfully made. One that has both an authentic swing and a unique verse that we talked about last week. But then the damage that has been done to us by the decisions we've made, the decisions that have been made against us, the things that have happened to us, and the things that we happened to others, the brokenness that we've experienced, the disappointments, the regrets, the grief, the struggles, it does something to us. It creates in us this shadow side. And the shadow side is what happens when we start operating out of our woundedness. And when we operate out of our woundedness, it continues to sabotage the health, the vibrancy, and the vitality of the relationships that we're in. There's an imposter, this side of ourselves that is not truly who we are. And I think many of us can identify there's been moments where we've done stuff and acted in ways that felt disingenuous to who we are. And that who we are is who we've been authentically created to be, that has been covered up and mired and perverted and corrupted by the damage that has been done to us. And part of what we're going to talk about in terms of spiritual formation is the awareness that comes by navigating the damage that's been done. It's not the denial of the damage, it's the recognition of the damage. It's the understanding of what the damage has done to us so that we can move through that damage and into a more healthy, holistic life. That's what formation wants to do. It wants to invite us through the brokenness and into the wholeness for which we've been created. But I want to spend some time talking about the kinds of damage that is done to us today. And so I've got this on the second page of lecture set 5. You're going to see at the top, there's a series of blanks here. And I want to talk to you about some of the ways in which the imposter, the shadow side, damages us, and the way in which spiritual formation wants to work through that, okay? And so the first one that I want to talk about is this idea of shame. Now, shame is, and I've written this here, it's a disfigurement of the soul that rejects worth or value. It can't embrace love because we don't feel worthy of it. It avoids contact with others and it fears humiliation. When in the garden, beautiful story of Adam and Eve in the garden, when they traverse God's boundaries, when they go and reach for that fruit that they weren't supposed to have, the first thing that they do is they hide and cover up. That's what shame wants to do. When we feel exposed, when we feel like we've taken some steps that have damaged us in some way, the first thing that we want to do is hide and cover up. We don't want to be seen in the midst of our vulnerability. Vulnerability feels like a threat to us. And so when we are living out of our shadow side and our imposter, we go into hiding. We cover up. And I think this plays itself out in our lives in a number of ways. We never get actually close to people. We never let people in. We don't feel like we are worthy of the kind of love that they would want to give to us. And so we sort of keep people at a distance. And shame disfigures our souls. It perverts and corrupts that sense of identity of who we actually are. And I think we need to be aware of the way in which shame is not in any way connected with the heartbeat, passion, and purposes that God has for each and every one of us. That shame is, in fact, that disfigurement. The second thing that I would say that the shadow side does is it makes us live into insecurity. Insecurity is when we live by comparison and competition. Insecurity is when we don't have a true sense of who we are. We can't live and be at home in our own skin. And our failure to be at home in our own skin often makes us susceptible to this challenged, where we're always sort of trying to compete with others or compare ourselves to others. Insecurity plays itself out when every time you see someone doing something on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, whatever, that you use Snapchat, where you're like, that should be me, or I should have that, where we sabotage people's happiness and joy because we don't feel good about ourselves. There's a beautiful story in which Jesus, he washes the feet of the disciples, and right before he washes the feet of his disciples, it says he had known where he came from, he knows whose he was, where he was headed, and what he'd been called to. He was at home in his own skin. He knew who he was. So he didn't have to live in constant comparison and competition with other people, but insecurity sabotaged that. So shame and insecurity play a role in what it means to live out this imposter or this shadow side of ourselves. The third thing is we live in fear. And I want to say we live in fear of two primary things. When our stories falter, when they fail us, depending on the kind of stories, when they unravel, we live in fear of fragility. So perhaps maybe part of our story is we've suffered some huge loss. We've lost someone close to us, and we come to terms with mortality, right? With the fragility of life. And that fragility of life has a way of lingering with us, hanging with us. And we're not always aware of the kind of damage that can do to us, where we're kind of wondering is how much happiness can I truly have? When is it going to be taken from me? And so life feels fragile. And so in that fragility, rather than allowing ourselves to feel that love or to feel that joy, we constantly sort of buffer that so that we're not utterly and absolutely disappointed when something falls apart. The other piece of that is scarcity. So what happens when something has fallen apart and everything's been taken from us? We don't feel like there's enough to go around, and so we're always fearful that we're going to run out, that there's not going to be enough for us. I find this a lot of times in people who've grown up in poverty, that they've lived in that scarcity and they're constantly afraid of that scarcity. In fact, I've seen people become rich who grew up in poverty, and they don't recognize that what they do is they live out of constant sense of greed, because greed is not what their intentions were. Their intentions were to avoid that scarcity, and so they live out of fearfulness. They can't be generous because they don't want to run out. And so we have to understand the ways in which shame and insecurity and fear corrupt and pervert our being in this world and keep us from living into the wholeness for which we've been created. The fourth thing is disconnection. When our stories fail us, when someone has wounded us and hurt us, when we have felt cheated, betrayed, or let down by our story, we disconnect from people. We keep people at arm's length. We are wired for connectivity. We are wired for community. We are wired for relationships. And when we've been wounded or beat down or betrayed, we intentionally disconnect. We keep people at arm's length. We don't allow ourselves that sense of intimacy that is a part of what human community is supposed to do for us. The next one would be distrust. So we disconnect, but we also distrust. There's a skepticism that we begin to embrace, one that seeks to deconstruct all of our stories, not believing that any story holds water, and not trusting those who embrace certain stories. This is really important for us, that as our stories fail us, unravel, show that they maybe are shaky, we start doubting everything, and we don't hold on to anything. And so there's no real truth. We doubt people who seem to hold on to certain stories. Maybe we've been damaged by the Christian story in some way, and so everybody who believes in the Christian story is a hypocrite, which I feel is sort of intellectually and emotionally dishonest, because that's often not the truth. Anytime I think we move towards absolutizing language, we're probably moving towards intellectual dishonesty, meaning that every time that at any time that we start to go, well, every and all, and it's always like this, rarely is it always and ever like anything. And we need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of the ways in which, if we're not careful, that absolutizing language can cause a sense of distrust, where we distrust anything and everything that remotely looks like a meaningful story. And the last two that I want to talk about are anger and indifference. Anger, I think, emerges from this sense of the failure of our stories, where we just sort of we sort of keep that sense of betrayal or that sense of brokenness deep within, and I'm going to wound before I'm wounded. I'm going to hurt before I'm hurt again. And so we tend to be presumptuous. We tend to be rash in our anger. We tend to keep our emotions very close to the surface, and it doesn't take much to set us off. Or indifference. I just give up, and I'm gonna binge watch my life away. And so I'm apathetic. I don't even care anymore. And what I want to say to you is, whether it's the shame, insecurity, fear, disconnection, distrust, anger, or indifference, all of these emerge out of the shadow side of ourselves. All of these are the result of us not living into the fullness for which we've been created. And all of these are the result of our failed stories. And so what we want to talk about in terms of spiritual formation is, how do we move through and move out of the brokenness of our stories and towards a sense of healing and wholeness, into embracing stories that hold water, and living into ways in which we can find health, healing, and wholeness. Before we move into the fourth lecture, I want to show you that video of grief and emotional well-being, and I want to invite you to check out this video. I think it's really important for us, and then we'll move into the last lecture for this day.